The NHL season is now half over, and there have been a lot of surprising teams that we have talked about on this channel, but today I want to focus on some of the most surprising players in both a good and a bad way. Before this season, I did a rough projection of where I thought each player was going to finish in terms of their production on the year, and now that we're halfway through the season, I want to compare their current pace to where I had them pegged to be at the end of the year, and I'm using that to give my biggest overachiever and underachiever for every single NHL team. And let's actually start out west in the Pacific Division with the San Jose Sharks, a scrappy team being led by an unlikely hero on the back end, Jake Walman. Yes, cover your ears, Red Wings fans, but Walman has been on a tear this year. He's already set a high in points with 25 through 31 games. He's a +4 on a team that is at the bottom of their division, which is pretty impressive, and his underlying analytics have been quite strong. He has been easily better than anybody in San Jose, and anybody in Detroit definitely thought that he would be this year. On the bad side though, Barclay Goodrow is my underachiever for the Sharks. I didn't expect much out of Goodrow after he was jettisoned to San Jose by the Rangers in the offseason, but through 38 games, only 2 goals and 4 points. It's not like his production is being held down by having less ice time than he was getting in New York. His possession stats are underwater with a Corsi barely over 40. It's been a rough one for Barclay Goodrow out in San Jose. Next up, we have the Seattle Kraken, who in an otherwise disappointing year have found a gem on the back line in young Riker Evans. He's already doubled his career high in points with 18 and 4 goals on the year. His ice time is up compared to his rookie year. His Corsi 4 is down compared to last year, yes, but I think that has a lot to do with the fact that Seattle is just significantly worse this year than they were last year. Overall, I think Riker Evans is having a good season and he's trending in the right direction, which is important. On the negative end though, a guy who got paid in the offseason and has not lived up to that extension, young Matty Beniers. Now his pace isn't terrible compared to last year. He's looking to end up with about 44 points and 14 goals, which is in line with the 15 goals, 37 points he had last year. Problem is last year he was on his rookie deal, not making over $7 million a year. I will say on the positive note that his defensive play appears to have improved this year, but for a guy you're hoping to see develop into a top line center, you'd want to see his offensive production improve. Above the Kraken, incredibly, we have the Anaheim Ducks, who have a lot of good young players on their team, and none has been a bigger surprise to me than Jackson LaCombe. The 24-year-old defenseman has already matched his career high in points with 17 and has 8 goals on the year. He's a +3 player on, again, a bad Ducks team. On the negative side for the Ducks though, it's one of their big free agent signings from a couple of years ago, Alex Killorn. He has just been a big disappointment since leaving Tampa, and this year it appears to have only gotten worse. He's on pace for 16 goals and 36 points, which would match his total from last year, and that's with his ice time being significantly lower than it was last year. Again, Killorn's definitely not the worst forward on their team, but relative to what expectations should be for a guy like him, especially a guy getting paid like him, he is not anywhere close to meeting that. Now, the Calgary Flames are one of the biggest surprises as far as teams go in the NHL, and it should be obvious who the biggest surprise in a positive way is for the team, goaltender Dustin Wolf. Now, in full transparency, I didn't do a projection for Dustin Wolf because he had such a limited NHL experience prior to this year, but he has blown that out of the water. A .914 save percentage in 21 games, the GAA of 2.6 and 2 shutouts on the year. Dustin Wolf has emerged as a legitimate starting goaltender in the NHL, and a damn good one at that. I don't know if he's the next coming of Connor Hellebuck or anything like that, so don't get too ahead of yourselves, Flames fans. For this year, he has been stellar. On the negative side though, it pains me to bash one of my favorite players from last year, Andrei Kuzmenko. While he had a really solid debut season with Calgary in 29 games for them last year, he put up 14 goals and 25 points. In 31 games this year, 1 goal, 10 points, -6. Making a lot of mental errors that are costing his team. He has been a colossal bust for this year, and the Flames should be thankful that they did not give him an extension after his good performance last year. And speaking of Kuzmenko, let's talk about the team who traded him away last year, the Vancouver Canucks, and their biggest pleasant surprise. And again, it has to be the goaltender. Kevin Lankinen has taken over in Thatcher Demko's early absence and has held down the fort for their starting netminder. On the year, he started in 27 games, has a save percentage of .904, a GAA of 2.60, and 3 shutouts. Those numbers, especially the save percentage, aren't jaw-dropping, but for a guy who was seen as a kind of journeyman backup, the Canucks got more than they could have hoped for while they were waiting for Demko to return. On the negative side, however, relative to expectations, you have to say that Elias Pettersson has been the biggest disappointment. And I know it seems silly to say that of a guy who has 10 goals and 28 points in 34 games, but that's what, a 50-60 point pace for the year? This is a guy who should be in the at least 80 point range every single year, and it's especially tough for Pettersson given the contract extension he got over the summer, which he deserved, but $11.6 million for a guy who isn't even going to score 70 points. That's just unacceptable. Obviously, there's the stories about tension between him him and the other leader of the Canucks, JT Miller. One of them is going to have to go. And I'm not saying that Vancouver should trade Pettersson. I personally would not. But if you're judging it off of who's performing this year and who is not, it's kind of hard to make the case for Pettersson. Above the Canucks, we go to the LA Kings, who have some great young talent, especially on their back end. Guys like Brant Clark have come out of nowhere, but the guy who really has impressed me the most is actually a guy who people were clowning on them for acquiring in the offseason. Joel Edmondson has been pretty decent in his own right this year after coming to the team in free agency. The 4 goals, 10 points on the year are kind of gravy for a player like Edmondson, but he's a plus player and has been pretty solid at his own defensive end. Not spectacular, but I and a lot of other people thought that he would be an absolute albatross in their own zone. And he's actually been respectable. On the disappointing end though, I have to go with Philip Deneau. I know he's mainly known as a two-way player and his ability to set up others, but only 3 goals in 37 games and 21 points is really rough for a guy who, to be fair, has been holding up his end of the bargain in the defensive zone. For the Oilers, it's been a weird season after that slow start. They have really caught on a heater, and a guy who is really chugging along that I didn't think would be doing that well is defenseman Brett Kulak. He's never really been an offensive defenseman. His career high is 21 points. He already has 5 goals and 14 points on the year, and most impressively, he's been doing it after stepping into a bigger role this year with a career high in average ice time, logging some big minutes for the Oilers. On the other hand, Zach Hyman has come down to earth after last year's ridiculous season. You had to know he wasn't going to score 54 goals again this year, but 13 in 35 games is a huge drop off, and he also hasn't really been contributing in the assist category, only 10 assists and 23 points on the year. You gotta hope that as the Oilers continue to heat up, Hyman will too. And finally, closing out the Pacific, we have the Vegas Golden Knights, and their biggest pleasant surprise is a guy who they actually just locked up to a long-term extension, Brett Howden, who's been doing the dirty work down in the bottom 6, but has been putting up career numbers to show for it. 21 points and 15 goals in 40 games this year. His career high in points is 23. He's probably going to clap that like next week or something. And again, defensively continuing to hold down the fort despite playing some tough minutes. On the flip side though, he was a big acquisition at the deadline, but Tomas Hertl has not been great this year for Vegas. I know he's on the wrong side of 30 and he had a down year last year, but he only has 11 goals and 26 points this year. And I was really expecting that he would have a bounce back season now in Vegas, a much better team than San Jose has been over the last few years. I thought he was going to be a 60, maybe even back to 70 point guy, and right now it looks like he'll be lucky to crack 50 on the year. Moving on to the Central Division, we start at the bottom with the Chicago Blackhawks. It hasn't been a pleasant year for a lot of people, but they did find a good young goaltender in Arvid Soderblom. At 25 years old, he's really getting a crack at the net in Chicago, and he's been playing very well. A 905 save percentage and a 2.92 GAA aren't that impressive on the surface, but he has a positive goal saved above expected per 60, which indicates that those stats are largely a result of the fact that the Blackhawks are not good. On the negative side for the Chicago Blackhawks though, I'm going to go with one of their ballyhooed offseason acquisitions in Teuvo Teravainen. He has not been terrible this year. 10 goals, 31 points in 44 games, slightly positive in Corsi and expected goals for, but I thought his acquisition was going to really help bolster that Blackhawks top 6 and help out guys like Connor Bedard a lot. And while Teravainen is doing quite well, he just hasn't had the impact that I think I was expecting. And before you jump down my throat at Blackhawks fans, the reason it's not Seth Jones is because I did not have high expectations of him going into this season. He's 30, he's not turning into the player we thought he was going to be. You gotta move past it. Up next, the Nashville Predators, and oh my god, it was so hard to find a player who's been overachieving for this disaster of a team. I finally settled on young defenseman Nick Blankenberg, again a guy I didn't expect to do much of anything this year, but he's played in 19 games, he's averaged 18 minutes of ice time, 2 goals, 4 points. Quite frankly, that's better than I thought he would do, which was basically nothing, because the entire team is just a massive disappointment, and leading the pack, and most appropriately leading this disaster of a team, Roman Josi's just had a bad year, and I know it's unfair to pin everything on him, but he is the captain, he is their best player, a player that I think should be in the Norris consideration every single year. He has not been that. He has not been bad. He is definitely the Nashville Predators' best defenseman. He is playing like a #1 defenseman on a bad team, which is not what I expected out of Roman Josi. Again, you could pick anybody from the Predators to fill the spot, and I wouldn't fight you on it, but Josi's just a guy I have a super high opinion of and super high expectations for, and he has not come close to meeting them. More a reflection on what I projected him to be than what he actually is this year. Now for the Utah Hockey Club, a guy that not a lot of people are talking about as being particularly impressive is their 25-year-old defenseman Michael Kesselring. 4 goals, 15 points on the year is quite impressive considering his career high was 21 points and 5 goals. His possession stats are not only at a career high, they've gotten better year over year. And on a very uneven Utah team, he's stood out as a bright spot. But in terms of dark spots, thoughts. I really thought after a strong season last year, Matias Maccelli was going to take another step forward, and he has taken a giant leap backwards. Only 5 goals and 8 assists for 13 points in 42 games this year. That's a lower pace for offense production than he was putting up even as a rookie, but the last 2 years he put up 49 and 57 points. This year it looks like he'll be lucky to sniff 30. Really puzzling for a guy who's only 24 years old, and I thought was trending in the right direction. This year has been a massive disappointment for Maccelli. Now on the positive side for St. Louis, when they made those offer sheets for Broberg and Holloway, I thought that they were pretty smart moves, and for Broberg, it has 100% paid off. They got a 23-year-old defenseman who's putting up career highs in points and goals, while also playing 20 minutes a night, again a career high for him compared to Edmonton, while also being a fairly respectable player in his own end. I think St. Louis pulled off a heist with that one. On the other hand though, Brandon Saad is aging like milk. He's only 32, but 7 goals and 14 points in 36 games. A change of scenery might be in order for him. For the Colorado Avalanche, their most impressive player in my opinion is Joel Kiviranta. After the decimation of their forward core at the beginning of the year, the Avs desperately needed a young winger to step up and produce, and Kiviranta, though not quite that young, did that admirably. He's put up 13 points and 10 goals in 42 games. Both of those marks career highs halfway through the season. He doesn't get a lot of ice time on the fourth line, but he is making the most of it, which is quite impressive for him. Their most disappointing player is actually somebody who's not even on the team anymore, and that's Alex Georgiev. I thought that Georgiev was a bit overrated by Avalanche fans in that he was a fringe starter slash high-end backup. This year, though, he was not even close to being a solid backup. For Colorado, he had an .874 save percentage and a 3.38 GAA, both of those career low marks. Now on to the Dallas Stars and their most impressive player. This is going to sound ridiculous when I say it. I think it's Ilya Lyubushkin. Now, he's not a guy who produces offensively, only 8 points on the year. Defensively, he has always been a liability, but this year, he's just been playing bad. Like, not terrible, just kind of not great. Honestly, this pick is mainly due to the fact that a lot of Dallas players are underachieving, and so when you have a player that I thought was going to be an anchor and atrocious on their back end, and he's just kind of not good, for Dallas this year, you kind of have to take that as a win. And in terms of their most disappointing players, again, it's one of their high-end guys. Jason Robertson has not been himself. Only has 10 goals and 32 points on the year. He's on pace for about 20 goals and 60 points. A guy who's halfway through a contract paying him just shy of $8 million a year, who is hoping to turn in another couple of good seasons into a massive extension in a few years. But if he keeps having seasons like this, he might actually be due for a paid downgrade. Above the Stars, we move on to the Minnesota Wild, who have found a young star in their forward core with Marco Rossi, a kid who's 3 points shy of tying his career high in points halfway through the season. He's got 15 goals, 22 assists, 37 points on the year, plus 17. Ice time is increasing, his possession quality hasn't dropped. Rossi is continuing to develop into a very good young center. On the other side though, Ryan Hartman at this point is just a jag. He's got 5 goals and 12 points in 36 games this year, which is disappointing for a guy that you figure is going to be a 30 to 40 point guy every single year. Right now, if I was Minnesota, I might be looking to move on for him when you have so many young options who can give you that same level of production. And then finally, rounding out the Western Conference, we have the Winnipeg Jets, and we'll start with their most impressive player. Kind of hard to pick because they've had so many very impressive players and players that I thought very highly of. I didn't think that highly of Neil Pionk going into the year, and he's been, again, relative to expectations, fine. Like, he's not good, but I would say he's passable, which is better than I thought he would be doing this year. And in particular, Pionk's been doing very well offensively, which is kind of a surprise. In terms of disappointments though, it's really hard for me to pick on somebody because there's not really many players who are underachieving this year, so I just went with Nikolai Ehlers. Again, this is not a knock on him and his performance. His points pace is about on par with what it was last year. I just thought that he was going to have a bounce back year and ratchet up his offensive production, which has not happened so far. Moving over to the Eastern Conference, we'll start at the bottom of the Metro Division with the Philadelphia Flyers, whose most impressive player for the year has been their young defenseman Jamie Drysdale. Obviously part of that big trade that sent Cutter Gauthier over to the Anaheim Ducks, but Drysdale has been playing very well in his first full season in Philly. He's only played in 31 games, but he already has 9 points on the season. And most importantly, his defensive game has really rounded out. He's a positive Corsi player and has emerged as a legitimate top 4 defenseman for the Flyers. On the other hand, their most disappointing player has unquestionably been Joel Farabee, their young forward. Only 6 goals and 14 points in 42 games, down from 22 goals and 50 points last year. Farabee is currently on pace to have the worst season production-wise since his rookie year when he scored 21 points and 8 goals in 52 games. And I think he could be a guy at the deadline that the Flyers might try to ship out and for a change of scenery. Moving up to the New York Islanders, their best player relative to expectations has been their captain Anders Lee. 19 goals, 35 points through 42 games, on pace to have his best production season of his entire career, potentially hitting 60 points for only the second time and at age 34 is quite impressive. But on the other hand, who is among the Islanders leadership group, Brock Nelson has had a down year, only 12 goals, 25 points on the year, coming off of back-to-back seasons where he had 75 and 69 points respectively. Still very competent defensively, but not bringing the offensive pop that the Islanders so desperately need. Above them on the New York Rangers, kinda hard to find somebody who's overperforming relative to expectations, but I went with Will Cooley, who halfway through the season has already set a career high in points with 24. He has 11 goals. He'll probably pass his career high in that this season in only his 3rd year. One of the few bright spots for the Rags, but on the opposite end, no surprise, the most disappointing player for them has been Mika Zibanejad. A massive down year from a guy who put up 91 points 2 years ago and 72 last year, only 8 goals and 27 points in 42 games, potentially looking at one of his worst years since he became a New York Ranger. Above them in the Pittsburgh Penguins, their overperforming player of the year has been defenseman Matt Grzelcyk, who's provided a good amount of offensive pop with 21 assists and 22 points on the year, and has been decent relative to expectations, a positive Corsi player on a struggling Penguins team. Again, Pittsburgh as a whole has been underperforming, but Grzelcyk I didn't have high expectations for this year. He's been quite solid for them so far. And on the opposite side, there's no way you can avoid the most disappointing player for the Penguins being Tristan Jarry, a guy who figured to be their starting netminder this year just like he was last year, but now putting up an .888 save percentage, a GAA of 3.3, 0 shutouts, that drama of being sent out to the minors, questions about his work ethic and his commitment to the team, and really destroying the Penguins' stability in net. Above them for the Columbus Blue Jackets, a team that has vastly overachieved relative to my expectations. Nobody has been a bigger surprise for the Jackets, or maybe even in the league, than Kirill Morchenko. 47 points in 43 games, career high for points and assists for the year. The 24-year-old has developed into maybe one of the best wingers in the NHL this year. On the opposite side though, another young player who has been struggling, 20-year-old Adam Fantilli, the former number 3 pick in the draft. He continues to struggle after a subpar rookie year, 21 points in 10 goals in 43 games. Just not driving the play offensively like you would expect from a top 5 pick. And moving up to the Carolina Hurricanes, I know everybody is expecting me to say Marty Necas as their big overachiever, but I'm not going to say that because Necas has one, cooled off over the last few months, and number 2, I had a very high expectation of him coming into this season. I'm actually going to give the overachiever award to Eric Robinson, a journeyman winger who's come into the Carolina Hurricanes and put up almost career highs in goals and points halfway through the season. He's been a very solid player defensively in the middle 6, and just another instance of Carolina betting low on a guy who has paid off massive dividends for them. On the opposite end of the spectrum though, age comes for us all, and for 39-year-old Brent Burns, it has come hard. 4 goals and 15 points in 43 games, which is on pace to be maybe his worst offensive season of his career, and that's especially troubling for a guy who's really always needed to be very productive in his offensive end to make up for the deficiencies as a defensive player. Burns' age is really starting to show at this point. But the New Jersey Devils, they also bought low from a player they picked off of the scrap heap in Jonathan Kovacevic, and that bet has paid off big time for them. 12 points on the year is almost at his career high halfway through the season, but his biggest contribution has been in the back end, where he's been a positive player in terms of quality scoring chances and has held up solidly in a shutdown role while also getting bigger minutes than he got his last 2 years in Montreal. On the other hand, for the Devils, I really thought that Luke Hughes could take a major step forward. He was such a promising young defenseman last year. This year, the offensive production has just not been there. 3 goals and 15 assists in 37 games. Now, to be fair, his defense has improved drastically from last year, but I kind of expected that, and I was really hoping that another leap forward offensively was going to offset that even further. So right now, Hughes is still very much a work in progress. And finally, rounding out the Metro Division for my Washington Capitals, the biggest overachiever has been Alexei Protas by far. I would have said McMichael earlier in the season, but Protas has really stepped up and McMichael's cooled off. For Big Pro, getting to play on a line with Alex Ovechkin and Dylan Strome really really helping him to emerge as a offensive threat. 36 points and 18 goals, both career highs. That 18 goals is actually more goals than he scored in his previous 3 years in the NHL combined. As far as disappointments go, their big free agent acquisition over the summer, Matt Roy, has been quite disappointing. Yeah, his offensive production is down, but that's really not why the Capitals signed him. In his defensive zone, he has struggled mightily this year, a negative player in the expected goal ratio for the first time since the 2020 season. I'm really hoping he can find his footing here in DC because it has not been great so far. And finally, moving over to the Atlantic Division, we're starting at the bottom. For the one player for the Buffalo Sabres who has not been terrible, that being defenseman Bowen Byram. He has 22 points on the year, that's 7 short of his career high. Defensively, he's been about at the same level he's been over his career, so seeing his offensive production ramping up is really good news for Buffalo. But on the opposite end, man, was I expecting Jack Quinn to step up big in his third season, and he has just not. 17 points and 8 goals in 36 games is not terrible, but he put up 9 goals and 19 points last year in his shortened 27-game season, so this year has been pretty disappointing, but he is not the only one. Moving up to the Montreal Canadiens, and it was really hard for me to pick who has been their most surprisingly impressive player. I'm just kidding, it's Lane Hudson. The kid has been outside of his mind this year for a guy that I didn't think was going to be able to find his footing in the NHL very easily. He has been a star so far. 32 points in 42 games, firmly in the Calder conversation if he keeps up this pace. At only 28 years old, he has been fantastic for Montreal. But on the opposite end, in terms of players who have not lived up to expectations, even though my expectations for him were lower than most, Canadiens fans cannot be happy that Juraj Slafkovsky has sort of plateaued this year. Only 4 goals in 39 games and 23 points. His ice time is down, his possession metrics are down from last year. It has not been a great third year for Slav, who is about to be getting paid a boatload of money next year and needs to step up his level of play. Moving up to the now surging Detroit Red Wings, their biggest surprise player has been another young defenseman, Simon Edvinsson. Only 16 points and 4 goals in 37 games. The dude has been logging 20 minutes a night and has played stout defensively with the best on-ice expected goal for ratio for a defenseman on the team, not named Mo Seider. On the other hand, a player who's disappointed is a guy that they brought in for some veteran leadership. Vlad Tarasenko's offensive production has cratered this year with only 4 goals and 14 points on the season, compared to his last 2 seasons where he hit at least 50 points. This is on pace to be Tarasenko's worst season since his rookie year. Moving on to the Ottawa Senators, and how about Nick Jensen this year, a guy they got in the Jacob Chikrin trade that I know I and a lot of other DC fans were happy to see go, but he has found a good role for himself here in Ottawa. Offensively, been doing about the same as he has been the last few years, but his defensive stats, both in Corsi and expected goal for ratio, both up to their best levels over the last 5 years. On the other side, the Pinto has stalled. Shane Pinto still continues to not be able to hit that next level of his development. Only 8 goals and 12 points in 33 games this year. Last year, he only played half a season, but he had 9 goals and 27 points. He's only 24, but for a guy who has a career high of 35 points, Ottawa fans have got to be getting worried about his development. Climbing up next to the enigma of a team that is the Boston Bruins, their biggest overachiever on the year, in my opinion, has been fourth liner Cole Koepka. Again, this is a situation where my expectations for him were basically on the floor, and he has exceeded them drastically. 7 goals, 12 points in 43 games, both career highs and both more than he had in his previous 2 years in Tampa. He's been a pretty solid player for a guy that I thought was going to be lucky to make the team. But on the other hand, a guy who's not played up to a big contract he got over the offseason has been their goaltender Jeremy Swayman. I know most Bruins fans would say that it has been Elias Lindholm, but in all honesty, I thought that that contract was a massive overpay when they gave it to him. I didn't have high expectations for him going into the year. Swayman, on the other hand, I thought was going to be a legitimate top-tier starting goaltender, and he has not been anything close to that. An .895 save percentage and a GAA of 2.91, career worst in both categories there. For a guy who was in Vezina conversations just last year, who held out and got paid big money, he is not performing to the level that he should be. Then we move to the Tampa Bay Lightning, who are getting some great offensive production throughout their lineup, but none has been more surprising than Anthony Cirelli, a guy who's always been an unsung hero, good for 30-40 points a year, but this year, 16 goals and 34 points in 39 games, pacing him to potentially have his first 50 or even 60, maybe 70 point season if he picks it up a little bit. And a guy who's also known for being very good defensively, maybe having his best year defensively as well. Cirelli, if he continues to pick things up and puts up good offensive numbers, could potentially be in the Selke conversation at the end of this year. Not entirely out of the realm of possibility. For underachievers though, the Lightning honestly don't really have a lot of them. I went with Nick Perbix just because his defensive metrics are down a little bit, but not too too much that I would be terribly worried, and offensively, his production is kind of in line where it's been the last few years. So Tampa fans, don't really stress. You've got a lot of players who are just filling their roles adequately. On to the Florida Panthers, though, who are getting a lot of productivity out of their defenseman Nico Mikkola, a guy who's bounced around in the NHL a lot, came to Florida last year, and this year is on pace to put up bests in offensive production with 14 points and 4 goals in 38 games. The 4 goals is a career high, and he's 3 off of his high in points. And then defensively as well, in terms of limiting shots and high quality scoring chances, he's having the best seasons of his career. Florida once again turning other teams' trash defensemen into their treasures. But on the other hand, a guy who has not performed well this year, and it really pains me to say this, is Matthew Tkachuk. Yes, he's a point-a-game player, 39 points in 38 games, but he had 88 points in 80 games last year and 100-point seasons the 2 years prior to that. He is a positive player defensively in terms of his expected goal ratio, but it's at a low from the last 4 seasons, and this is really just one of those instances where you have a guy that I think is an all-star caliber player who is not playing like it at the moment. He's still playing like a very good player, but I think there's another gear Tkachuk can get to that he hasn't this year, and a lot of other Florida players are playing up to expectations. And then finally, we have the Toronto Maple Leafs, and their biggest overachiever, in my opinion, has been John Tavares, stripped of the captaincy, kind of written off in the last year of his contract. It was a foregone conclusion that he would move on. His productivity had been dipping. He's a point-a-game player this year, 42 points in 43 games and 20 goals. Potentially, he could be flirting with career highs in both of those marks halfway through the season. And this level of play is probably, quite frankly, making Maple Leafs brass question whether or not it's worth to bring it back for another year or two. But on the other hand, Max Domi was an impact player for them last year with 9 goals and 47 points. This year, through 36 games, only 3 goals and 15 points. And along with the offensive production dipping, just has not been quite as physical as you would like, and a little bit in his own zone, making him the biggest underachiever for the Montreal Canadiens this year.